Forged Era, 40-minute documentary script, Sonnet 5, final, humanized. In 1862, Syracuse, New York, produced 9,053,874 bushels of salt. More than half of all the salt made in the United States that year came out of the ground along Onondaga Lake. Not mined, not quarried, but boiled and evaporated from brine in 17,000 iron kettles running day and night from April to November. 3,000 workers tended 6,000 acres of evaporating vats, fed by 75 miles of brine pipes. The city that did this called itself the Salt City. The name was not a boast, it was an inventory. Today, Syracuse carries a poverty rate reaching nearly a third of its residents. Child poverty stands at 45.6%. The industry that built the city is gone, and so, it turns out, is most of what it built. This is the story of the brine underneath Syracuse, the fortune it produced, and the century it took to disappear. Chapter 1. The Brine. The story does not begin with salt. It begins earlier than salt, earlier than water, earlier than the outline of anything that would later be called New York. About 420 million years ago, in the Silurian period, an inland sea across the middle of the continent began to evaporate under a climate no human eye would ever witness, leaving behind a bed of rock salt. Over time, geologic time, indifferent time, shale settled over the salt bed and sealed it, layer upon layer, the way a lid settles over a pot left too long on the stove. The salt did not go anywhere. It waited. It waited through ice ages. During the most recent one, glaciers ground south across what would become central New York, carving out the deep channel geologists call the Onondaga Trough. The carving was not sudden. It happened the way glaciers do everything, in a slow, grinding patience measured in millennia rather than seasons. When the ice finally retreated, it left meltwater behind. Meltwater that did what water does to buried salt. It found the cracks, it dissolved the mineral, it carried it upward as a concentrated brine, saturated far beyond what an ordinary spring produces. Some of that brine, tested by hydrologists centuries later, would be dated to roughly 16,700 years old, older than agriculture, older than the wheel, older than any name the salt would eventually carry. The brine had to go somewhere, and it went where the trough directed it, to the surface, along the southern shore of a lake that did not yet have a city beside it. It emerged as natural springs at 3 points, Salina, Geddes, and Liverpool, 3 low, marshy stretches of shoreline, where the ground itself tasted faintly of the sea, though no ocean was anywhere near it. Salina, in particular, would not stay a footnote. It would matter later, matter enough to lend its name to the city that eventually grew up around it. For now, it was simply where the water was strongest. No one ever sank a shaft here. No one ever built a mine. That is the detail easiest to miss and the one that mattered most. The fortune was never dug out of the ground. It was not extracted like coal, or blasted like ore, or hauled up in buckets from underground galleries the way salt was mined elsewhere in the world. Every bushel of it came from the surface, from water drawn out of springs and set to boil in iron kettles, or from water spread thin in shallow vats and left to the sun and the wind until nothing remained but crystal. The labor was in the boiling and the waiting, not in the digging. Men tending fires under iron kettles or watching vats under an open sky, extracting what the ice and the ancient sea had already prepared for them. The rock salt itself, 420 million years old, sealed under shale, stayed exactly where the Silurian Sea had left it. It never moved. What made the fortune possible, in other words, was not human ingenuity. It was an accident, an ancient sea that happened to evaporate in the right place, an ice sheet that happened to carve a trough in the right direction, meltwater that happened to find the salt and carry it upward, rather than sealing it deeper. Geology did the work. The city that rose beside the lake would spend the next century taking credit for it. The springs kept surfacing at Salina, at Geddes, at Liverpool, indifferent to who came to collect what rose from them. The brine was already there before there was a village. It would still be there after the village was gone. Chapter 2. The Keepers of the Central Fire. Long before there was a village named for a Sicilian city, long before there was a state agency to lease the salt lots, long before there was a canal to carry anything anywhere, there was a lake and a nation that understood exactly what that lake meant. The Onondaga called themselves the Keepers of the Central Fire. It is not a title bestowed by outsiders. It is a role, one of 5 founding nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, bound together under a single law and, by tradition, a single council fire kept always at the center. That fire was kept by the Onondaga on the shores of the lake that would later carry their name in a European mouth, Onondaga Lake. Tradition holds that it was here, on this shoreline, that the peacemaker Deganawida, working with Hiawatha, delivered the great law of peace, the Constitution, unwritten and recited, that bound 5 warring nations into one confederacy and ended, or was meant to end, generations of conflict among them. This was not myth kept at a distance. It was a shoreline that could be walked, a water that could be touched, a specific bend in the land where an agreement was reached and kept. This was the lake's first meaning, long before Syracuse existed to give it a second one. Not brine, not bushels, not the 17,000 kettles that would one day burn along its edges. Governance, law, peace, negotiated in a place because a people believed the place itself carried weight. Stand at the lake's edge in those years, and you would have found no salt works, no canal, no city waiting to be platted. Only the fire, and the council it called together, and the law it was meant to keep. Then a Frenchman came to taste the water. Simon Le Moyne had been born in Beauvais in 1604. He came to the Onondaga as a Jesuit missionary, and in 1654, while he was among them, he was shown one of the springs that surfaced along the lake's southern shore, the same brine that had been rising out of the Salina group for roughly 16,700 years, indifferent to who stood over it. The Onondaga would not drink from it. They told Le Moyne an evil spirit fouled the water. Le Moyne tasted it anyway. He found it to be salt water, and he did what a 17th century European did with salt water. He boiled it down and made salt from it, and pronounced the result, in his own words, as natural as that which comes from the sea. A college in Syracuse would one day carry his name. Le Moyne College. No church, no shrine, no formal marker would carry the name of the spring, or the lake, or the nation that had warned him away from it. Here is what the moment contains, without ornament. A people who had kept the central fire at this water's edge, who had watched a peacemaker deliver a law of peace on this shoreline, told a stranger not to drink. The stranger drank, tasted salt, and saw not a warning but an opportunity. What one nation understood as a place of meaning, one man understood as a resource. Both were standing on the same ground. Both were looking at the same water. The Onondaga did not leave the lake. They had not left it when Le Moyne knelt at the spring, and they have not left it since, not for salt, not for canals, not for anything the water would later be made to carry. The nation that had kept the central fire here, that had watched a peacemaker deliver a law of peace on this ground, held its claim through everything that followed. The Onondaga remained. Chapter 3: The Salt Springs Law. The story of Onondaga salt had begun as a story of meaning. In 1788, it became a story of money. That year, 2 pioneers named Asa Danforth and Comfort Tyler set kettles over open fire at the springs and began to boil. They worked one 5-gallon kettle at a time, feeding the flame, skimming the brine, watching the water disappear into crystal by the ounce, and then by the pound. It was not an industry yet. It was two men and a kettle and a spring that had sat there for 16,700 years, and it did not resemble the future it was about to start. The following year, a settler named Nathaniel Loomis carried 500 to 600 bushels of Onondaga salt to market and sold every bushel of it at $1 a bushel. It was the area's first commercial sale, and it proved the only thing that mattered to the men who came after Danforth and Tyler and Loomis, that brine boiled at Onondaga Lake could be turned into coin reliably, at a price a farmer or a fur trader or a meat packer downstate was willing to pay. New York State noticed. On April 1st, 1797, the legislature passed the Salt Springs Law, and with a single act made a decision that would define Syracuse for the next century. The springs themselves would belong not to the men who worked them, but to the state itself. Not the wood a boiler burned, not the kettle a boiler owned, but the brine underneath it all. That belonged to Albany. Private producers could lease individual salt lots from the state. They could boil, evaporate, pack, and sell. What they could not do was own the ground the salt came out of. The state ran the inspection warehouses. The state weighed every barrel. The state collected a duty on every bushel a kettle produced, and the state appointed William Stevens as the first superintendent of what it now called the Onondaga Salt Springs Reservation, a tract that would eventually grow to some 15,000 acres of state-owned brine land, wrapped around a lake the Onondaga had never agreed to sell in the first place. Every fortune that followed sat on that arrangement. The men who built the boiling blocks and hauled the wood and stacked the barrels for shipment made money from salt they never owned, drawn from springs they never owned. On state land, they leased a lot at a time. They paid for the privilege with the duty, 12.5 cents a bushel, when the legislature set the rate in 1817, a figure attached that same year to a much larger purpose. The salt duty became one of several revenues the state pledged to secure the debt on a new canal, a project not yet built, not yet named, already leaning on the springs at Salina and Geddes and Liverpool to help pay for its own construction. The rate did not hold. 12.5 cents in 1817 became 1 cent by 1846, a flat rate that would not move again for 62 years, until 1908. Canal tolls, not the salt duty, carried most of that debt in the end, and even those tolls were written to favor Syracuse. A boat of foreign salt paid a higher toll than a boat carrying salt made at Onondaga. The state had built itself a customer it also happened to own a piece of, and had written the tariff to make sure the customer kept buying local. By the 1820s, the arrangement was fixed: a spring on state land, a lot leased to a private boiler, a duty paid on every bushel, feeding a canal that had not yet entered the picture. The salt was Onondaga's. The law was Albany's. The canal would take both. Chapter 4. The Ditch and the Name. Construction began on July 4, 1817, at Rome, New York, on the canal that the salt duty had been pledged 3 months earlier to help secure. Not a metaphorical excavation, an actual one. Men with shovels and horse-drawn scrapers, cutting a channel 40 feet wide through farmland and forest, working east and west from Rome in both directions at once. The canal fund that would carry the debt had been created on April 15, 1817. It would be retired, in full, by 1836, a decade after the water first moved through it. The canal itself opened on October the 26th, 1825, 8 years and 4 months after the first shovel went into the ground, at a cost of just over $7 million. Its route ran directly through what was, in 1817, still salt marsh and swampland at the southern edge of Onondaga Lake, through the exact ground where Danforth and Tyler had boiled their first kettle 30 years before. By 1825, that marsh had a name, a street grid, and a village charter. The man most responsible for placing the canal on that particular stretch of marsh was Joshua Foreman, later called the founder of Syracuse. In 1808, Foreman had carried a resolution through the New York legislature, calling for a survey of a canal route connecting the Hudson River to Lake Erie, 9 years before ground broke at Rome, 9 years before any duty on salt had been pledged to secure anything at all. He kept at it through the years the resolution sat unfunded. In 1819, with the canal now under construction and its path through Onondaga County settled, Foreman platted the village of Syracuse on the marsh south of the lake, laying out lots and streets on ground that had been, within living memory, nothing but brine springs and cattails. The village needed a name before it could be a village in more than the surveyor's sense, and the naming was its own small argument. In 1820, John Wilkinson proposed Syracuse, after the ancient Sicilian city, a city that had also sat beside salt flats, near its own settlement called Salina. The parallel was not incidental, and it was not lost on the men choosing a name for a marsh full of salt springs of their own. The alternative on the table was Corinth. Corinth was rejected, not on any grounds of history or symmetry, but because another New York town already carried that name, and the Postal Service could not tell the two apart. Syracuse survived a naming dispute decided by a mail route. The village of Syracuse incorporated in 1825, the same year the canal opened. The same year $7 million became a fact on the ground instead of a figure in a ledger. Boats moved through the center of the new village now, carrying salt out, carrying settlers and lumber and manufactured goods in. The village grew the way canal towns grew in that decade. Fast, close to the water, with little patience for anything that was not commerce. It took 23 more years for the city to catch up to the ambition of its name. The city of Syracuse was chartered in 1848, merging the village of Syracuse with its older neighbor, the village of Salina, the strongest of the original salt springs, the place Danforth and Tyler had boiled their first bushel, the place that had lent its name to a Sicilian city 3,000 years dead, before that city lent its name back. Salina did not survive the merger as a government. It survived as a neighborhood, then as a street sign, then as little more than an echo inside a larger city that now carried its story without carrying its name. Harvey Baldwin became the new city's first mayor. The ditch had a name now. The name had a history it did not advertise. Chapter 5. 17,000 Kettles. Syracuse made its salt two ways, and both ran on fire and patience rather than machinery. The first was boiling. Along the shore and through the streets of Salina and Geddes, kettle blocks stood in long iron rows. Roughly 17,000 kettles in all. Set over brick arches, running through April, running through the height of summer, running through November, before the frost finally shut them down. Fed day and night, by fires that burned through something like 200,000 cords of wood a year. That is a forest, cut and split, and hauled by cart, disappearing into smoke every 12 months so the brine in those kettles could be boiled down to crystal. The second method needed no fire at all. Shallow wooden vats, lined black to draw the sun's heat, spread across the flats in blocks of their own, sheltered by wheeled roof covers that workers rolled shut the moment a storm moved in off the lake. By 1900, more than 43,000 of these covers stood in the salt yards, sliding open and closed with the weather like a machine built entirely out of wood and labor. Picture the southern shore of Onondaga Lake on a summer afternoon in 1862. The vats run for acres in every direction, black-bottomed and brimming, their covers folded back to take the sun. Beyond them, the kettle blocks send up columns of white steam and gray wood smoke that never quite clear before the next batch starts boiling. The air carries brine and ash in equal measure, a smell that settled into clothes and hair and did not wash out easily. The sound is constant, fires cracking under the arches, kettles ticking as they cool, cartwheels grinding over plank roads, hauling wood in and barreled salt out. Men moved through all of it in lines, feeding fires, rolling covers, raking crystals, the way ants move through a hill too large for any single ant to see the shape of. A visitor, standing at the edge of the yards that day, would have looked out over 6,000 acres of vats and 17,000 kettles and understood, without being told, that a war 300 miles south had nothing on this. There was a reason the peak came in the middle of that war and not before it or after. The Union blockade had sealed off the southern ports that once supplied salt to the Confederacy, and salt was never a luxury. It preserved meat, cured hides, and kept armies fed on the march. General Sherman called it contraband of war, worth denying to the enemy as surely as gunpowder or rifles. Every bushel Syracuse boiled or dried in 1862 was a bushel the South could not buy, and Washington treated the men who made it accordingly. Salt workers received exemptions from Civil War military service, kept at their kettles, instead of sent to the front because the ledgers made the calculation for them. The 9 million bushels that came out of Onondaga County that year were not simply a record. They were a wartime necessity, boiled by men who never had to carry a rifle to serve the Union. The profit from that necessity did not spread evenly across the men who fed the fires. In 1860, the largest producers folded themselves into the Onondaga Salt Company, a cartel that fixed prices and coordinated output across the salt yards the way no individual producer, working alone with a handful of kettles, ever could. The company rode the wartime boom to about $6 million in profit, drawn from a demand that a war none of its officers had to fight had created. The men who split the wood, tended the arches, and rolled the covers against the rain kept their day's wage and their exemption from the front. The company kept the rest, and the rest, in 1862, was considerable. The lakeshore had never produced this much. It never would again. Chapter 6. What the Salt Built. The salt had peaked. The city had not. The kettles kept boiling, the vats kept evaporating, and the salt company kept its cartel intact for a while yet. But the fortunes and the workforce the salt trade had assembled were already spilling into other channels the salt itself had never touched. By the turn of the century, the money the salt yards had generated, the labor the canal had trained, and the freight lines the canal had laid down were already building something else entirely. Syracuse turned from a salt town into a manufacturing town almost without pausing to notice the difference, and the names on the new payrolls had nothing to do with brine. Enter Herbert H. Franklin. His Franklin Automobile Company sold its first car on June 23, 1902, air-cooled and expensive, built for buyers who did not think twice about the price. Franklin became the last major American maker of air-cooled luxury automobiles, and for 2 decades, the plant grew with the rest of the city around it. Employment peaked at 3,210 workers in 1920. The company went bankrupt in 1934. The 4 Smith brothers built typewriters instead. Their L.C. Smith and Brothers Typewriter Company, founded in 1903, merged with Corona in 1926 to become Smith Corona. And by 1936, the combined company employed more than 4,000 people, a workforce that, like Franklin's, had never touched a salt kettle in its life. Cars, then letters, then something bigger still. The city no longer needed the lakeshore to make money. Not the old way, not anymore. Neither company was the largest fortune the era produced. That belonged to a plant with everything to do with the lake the salt had come from. In 1881, the Belgian chemists Ernest and Alfred Solvay founded the Solvay Process Company with 2 Americans, Roland Hazard and William Cogswell. Their plant opened in 1884 on the shore of Onondaga Lake, the first ammonia soda plant in the Western Hemisphere, the Beauseant built almost within sight of the boiling blocks that had defined the city for 100 years. A village grew up around the gates and took the founder's name, Solvay. The company merged into Allied Chemical in 1920. Remember that plant on that shore. It comes back. The smaller names filled in around the large ones. Kraus-Heinz, founded in 1897, installed a synchronized traffic signal system at James and State Streets in 1922. Willis Haviland Carrier, who had invented modern electrical air conditioning in 1902, moved Carrier's manufacturing into the vacated Franklin automobile plant in 1937. Continental Can Company shipped its first cans from its Syracuse factory in 1905. A car company, a chemical company, an air conditioning company, the Salt City had become, in the span of 2 generations, a city that made almost everything except salt, and shipped it out on the same canal and the same rail lines the salt had once traveled. The population climbed with it. By 1850, it stood at 22,271. By 1900, 108,374. By 1920, 171,717. By 1930, 209,326. By 1950, it reached 220,583, the highest Syracuse would ever record, and nobody standing in the city that year had reason to think the number would run the other way. Downtown rose to match it. The Gridley Building went up on Clinton Square in 1867, beside the canal that had made the square worth building on. Syracuse University was chartered in 1870. Hotel Syracuse opened in 1924. The Art Deco State Tower building, finished in 1928, became the tallest building in the city, and remains so today. Nearby stood a smaller, plainer structure that nobody thought to admire in 1928, the Waylock Building, built in 1850 to weigh the canal boats and collect the tolls on them, the only building of its kind left standing anywhere in the country. Keep it in mind, it comes back, too. By 1950, Syracuse had a population it would never see again, a skyline it had not had in 1848, and a payroll spread across cars, typewriters, soda ash, cans, traffic signals, and air conditioners. None of it depended on a single bushel of salt anymore. The lakeshore, the canal bank, and the courthouse square all looked, that year, like they would hold. Chapter 7. The Tide Goes Out. The end came quietly, the way these things do. In August of 1926, the Onondaga Coarse Salt Company, the last commercial producer left in the business, drew its final batch, and an industry that had put Syracuse on the map for the better part of a century simply stopped running. No single event caused it. The brine itself had been thinning for decades, diluted year over year as the springs gave up less concentrated water than they once had. A windstorm tore through the salt yards in 1922 and left the covers and the vats in wreckage that was never fully rebuilt. Cheaper rock salt, mined and shipped in from Michigan and from western New York, undercut what Syracuse could still produce at any price that made sense. Coal, which had fired every kettle and every boiling block for 100 years, kept getting more expensive to bring in. The state, which had underwritten the whole enterprise since 1797, had long since stopped reinvesting in it. The reservation that had once run to 15,000 acres was, by the 1920s, a diminished thing, its purpose largely spent. The math had simply stopped working in 5 different ways at once, and none of them needed to be dramatic to add up to the end of an industry. It was 5 slow leaks in the same boat, and by 1926, the boat had taken on more water than it could bail. Brine extraction continued after 1926, quietly feeding the soda ash plant on the lake shore. But it went now through pipes, straight into an industrial process, not into evaporating vats tended by hand. The open salt fields, the boiling blocks, The kettles that had once run day and night from April to November were gone. The canal went next, or rather, it went around. Built between 1905 and 1918, the barge canal rerouted the waterway north of downtown, bypassing the city the Erie Canal had built. Between 1922 and 1925, the original downtown channel, the one that had carried salt east to the Hudson and given the city its reason for being, was filled in and paved over as Erie Boulevard. Downtown Syracuse had grown up around that channel for a century. Streets and warehouses and docks, all built to face water that after 1918 was simply no longer there. Traffic ran over it now instead of boats, wide and straight where the boats had once tied up. The canal that had made the city no longer ran through it. Remember that plant on that shore. In June of 1986, the Solvay Soda Ash Works, Allied Chemical by then, closed for good, taking with it about 1,400 jobs. Carrier moved its headquarters out of Syracuse in 1990 and closed its last local plants by 2003, shifting roughly 1,200 manufacturing jobs overseas. General Motors' Inland Fisher Guide plant closed by 1993, with 1,300 employees let go. Smith Corona, which had built typewriters in the city since 1903, filed for bankruptcy in 1995, ending a century of American typewriter manufacturing in the place that had done more of it than almost anywhere else. New Venture Gear shut its doors by 2012. After 124 years in business, chemistry left, automobiles left, typewriters left, gears left. What the salt money had financed, one plant at a time, over the better part of a century, closed in the space of a single generation. Something else was happening at the same time, a few blocks from downtown. In the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the state built an elevated highway, Interstate 81, straight through the 15th Ward, the heart of the city's black community. In 1950, about 4,000 African Americans had lived in the 15th Ward, 8 of every 9 black residents of Syracuse. The clearance proceeded across those years, not as a single act, but as a sustained demolition, until more than 1,300 families had been displaced and over 90% of the ward had been bulldozed. In 1963, civil rights protests at the demolition sites led to dozens of arrests. The highway went up on the cleared ground, elevated on concrete piers above what had been, until then, a neighborhood. The AME Zion Church survives. It is the only structure of the city's oldest black congregation still standing. The ward around it does not. Chapter 8. What Remains. Syracuse today holds close to 148,000 people. The 2020 census recorded 148,620 residents, the city's first population gain in more than 70 years. The first time since the 1950 peak that the number moved up instead of down. Growth is not the same as recovery. Poverty reaches from roughly a quarter to nearly a third of residents. Child poverty stands at 45.6%, among the highest of any city in the nation. Median household income runs around $51,770, roughly 63% of the national figure. In 2015, the researcher Paul Jargowski, writing for the Century Foundation, ranked Syracuse first among the 100 largest American metro areas for the concentration of poverty among its black and Hispanic residents. Not first in salt anymore. Not first in typewriters. Not first in soda ash. First in this. Onondaga Lake carries its own accounting. The Solvay waste beds, soda ash waste dumped along the shore since 1884, cover more than 300 acres, capped now, mowed now, used each September to park cars for the state fair. Between 1946 and 1970, Allied Chemical discharged 165,000 pounds of mercury into the water below them. The lake was listed as a federal Superfund site in 1994. Honeywell has spent roughly $451 million on the cleanup, with total watershed spending approaching $1 billion across the basin. The Onondaga Nation, the keepers of the Central Fire, the people who once told a Jesuit priest not to drink from this water, dispute that the cleanup goes far enough. The Onondaga remained through the salt, through the canal, through the chemical plant on the shore. They remain now watching a company measure in parts per million what they once measured in something closer to sacred. The present-day economy runs on what people here call eds and meds. Upstate Medical University alone employs more than 13,000 people, more than Franklin Automobile employed at its peak, more than Smith Corona ever did, though it manufactures nothing anyone can hold. In October 2022, Micron Technology announced a semiconductor plant in the neighboring town of Clay, up to $100 billion over 20 years, a figure the wartime salt cartel never approached in its best year. Groundbreaking is set for January 2026. Production is targeted for around 2030, a promise the city has learned, across 2 centuries, to treat with some patience. The salt era left fewer traces than the manufacturing era that replaced it, and both are shrinking. The Waylock building still stands. Built in 1850 to weigh canal boats and collect tolls, the only surviving canal Waylock building left in the United States. It has housed the Erie Canal Museum since 1962, converted from tallying debts to explaining them. A few blocks south, the Salt Museum keeps a reconstructed boiling block. Sunken iron kettles, arranged the way 17,000 of them once stood along the lakeshore, cold now, explained by a placard instead of tended by a fire. Above the old 15th Ward, the Interstate 81 viaduct is coming down at last. Deconstruction beginning in the summer of 2026. The elevated concrete replaced by a street-level community grid where the highway once ran on piers. None of it is as visible as the wastebeds. Drive along the lake's western edge, and the ground beside the road is pale, almost white, where the grass runs thin, flat enough that for 1 week each year it holds thousands of parked cars for the state fair. In September, when the fair is running, headlights sweep across that grass by the thousand and radios play, and nobody parking there asks what is under the tires. Nothing marks it as anything but a field. It is the largest single object the chemical age left behind. And the plainest, no name on it, the way the Waylock building has a name, no gate the way the Franklin plant once had a gate. It is wealth turned to poison, turned to a parking lot, capped with grass, paved at the edges, and thousands of drivers pass it every day without knowing what it is. Under the waste beds, under the filled canal, under the highway coming down, the brine is still there. It was there before the village. It is there now.